In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, all you sublated leftists out there. It's me, Douglas Lain. I am the host of the Sublation Magazine show, editor-in-chief of Sublation Magazine, head honcho at Sublation Media, and the sublated Gen Xer. With me today is Benjamin Studebaker. You want to introduce yourself, Ben?
Yes, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker. I have a PhD in Politics and International Studies from the University of Cambridge, and I'm the author of two books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
So last week, we discussed the notion of regression. I gave an example of Mac the Knife. It was, for me, a revelation to watch Bertolt Brecht's song, or look back on how Bertolt Brecht's song had been transformed and I think regressed historically. I had read Adorno's essay on commitment and brought that to Ben in the stream. And we ended up, surprisingly to me, discussing generational politics and the difference between a Gen X perspective on culture and a millennial perspective on culture. And in a variety of ways, we ended up discussing generational politics in the after party, on Patreon afterwards. It would be as a major topic. I think Ben took, his licks or a lot of maybe not even completely fair criticism in the after party. So in that spirit, I'm going to try to give you some criticism today. We had a email exchange, but I want to point out that I'm basing this criticism in the spirit of solidarity. Before I started the stream, just a little bit before the stream was scheduled to begin, I sent you a link to a video I'd made, I don't know, over a year ago, I think, on understanding Generation X, it's called. And the thesis for that video is that we're all Gen X. Of course, I would say that, right? Every generation since World War II has been Gen X, was the argument I make in the video. So I want to start there. Would you accept that as a millennial, that in fact, the reality is that like the boomers before us and the silent generation before them, and maybe one generation before them, we have been Gen X since the middle of the 20th century, and maybe even since World War I. What do you think about that idea?
I mean, yes and no. It depends very much on whether we're looking to emphasize points of continuity or change. And of course, change occurs, and sometimes we are trying to be interested in change, and other times we're concerned about a lack of solidarity and therefore want to emphasize continuity. But of course, things do change, and so the change side of it is equally valid.
Well, okay, I think that's true. I mean, in broad strokes, I can't disagree that society is both changing and remaining the same. The way I tend to think about that is that we have something that I think about Moish Bastone's treadmill dynamic. So we're in a dynamic capitalist system with perpetual change, technical innovation, for instance, cultural change. And at the same time, the basis of that society remains the same, and the fundamental contradictions in society remain the same. So, as an example,
there's a sense in which it's still capitalism, but also what does capitalism do? It completely transforms society all the time.
Right. Well, but before we get into it too much, I want to run. I have this little clip from the Gen X. It's not so little, but I'll run a bit of this clip from the Gen X thing and to set the stage. Is that all right with you, or should? Yeah, okay. Generation X. What does that name mean? In math, an unknown or missing value is represented by an X. And I think a generation marked X would be a missing or perhaps a lost generation. The author who named my generation X was Douglas Coupland. His novel told the stories of three 20-somethings living in Southern California in 1990. Published in 1991, the book's interior design reflects the aesthetic of desktop publishing. The prose is represented in blocks of text surrounded by negative space, and each page includes marginalia, offering commentary, slogans, and definitions of key terms. For example, in the first section, we are presented with the definition for the term historical underdosing in the right-hand margin, as the main text describes the conversation between Dag, Claire, and the main character, Andy. These characters describe their disappointment as they drink mystery cocktails on the veranda of their Palm Springs bungalow and eye the saddle-shaped home of the comedic actor and TV star Bob Hope, a home that sits up on a hill in the distance. Historical underdosing is defined this way: to live in a period of time when nothing seems to happen. Major symptoms include addiction to newspapers, magazines, and TV news broadcasts. The X in Generation X is not simply an empty marker. The value marked by X is definitely lost and not merely unknown. Or perhaps the value is known, but only as an absence. Another name for a person born in my generation is slacker. This comes from a film directed by Richard Linklater that was released the same year that Coupland's Generation X was published. Slacker is a non-narrative film wherein the camera wanders through the lives of a large cast of characters. It is a film about a milieu, a place, and the story it tells is impressionistic, poetic, and not linear. Coupland's novel is littered with marginalia on topics like vaccinated time travel, the fantasy of traveling back in time, but only with proper vaccinations, or decade blending, the indiscriminate combination of two or more items of clothes from different or various decades, quant earrings, platform shoes, a black leather jacket like Fonzie wore. Some have described the book as a novel disguised as a magazine article, while the dialogue in Linklater's movie sounds like what you'd hear on a public radio call-in show. Linklater doesn't offer us quasi-authoritative definitions, but rather presents us with wild theories and personal credos.
Anything else you want to...
Yeah, there's something else. To all you workers out there, every single commodity you produce is a piece of your own death.
What was your relationship like with your...
End of interview.
To really understand the significance of the X in Generation X, however, we have to skip back 2 generations. Generation X was invented by the Hungarian photographer Herbert Kappa as a title for a photo essay published in Holiday magazine. The article was about young adults whose childhoods had been defined by World War II, about the generation that would be called the Silent Generation. They were a cohort with a past they wanted to forget, and who tried to look forward to the future for hope. That is, in 1954, the X in Generation X was an undefined future. The next time the term Generation X would appear in print was 1964 in a book that attempted to explain what was on the minds of teenagers in Britain. The book was a collection of interviews and ephemera generated by teens the author Jane Deverson met as she toured around Britain looking for clues. These boomer teens, the next generation to be called X, held opinions that would be unsurprising, even mundane in today's environment defined by Twitter, or X, and TikTok. Quote, "Religion is for old people who have given up on living." Quote, "My life will probably be quite futile. Most lives are. But then the general prospects for the future are not too bright, are they? The human race seems to have made a right old mess of things, hasn't it?" Quote, Security can be a killer and corrode your mind and soul, but I wish I had it. Quote, you'd really hate an adult to understand you. That's the only thing you've got over them, the fact that you can mystify and worry them. When one looks back on the various generations called X, what is immediately obvious is that the X is never truly empty of content. And yet each generation X attempts to break free of its conditions, of its moment or context, in order to be self-determining. And along the way, each generation has lost its freedom and meaning both. The still living Generation X and the Millennials and Zoomers who came after us, X's all, have taken up the dilemma by externalizing it. We are our own cameras, or if not that, then we are our own digital creations, and we carry electric eyes around with us so that we can take control of our own objectivity. And yet each selfie we take, each moment wherein we continue to hide from our own substance, from our own conditions of possibility, reproduces a crisis that made us into an X to begin with. As Adorno said of Beckett's film, describing Buster Keaton's fate, the catastrophe at the end of it doesn't directly correspond to death, but rather it corresponds to a death sentence to life, a kind of living death as an object for a self that has no ground.
Anything else you want to?
Yeah, there's something else. To all you workers out there, every single commodity you produce is a piece of your own death.
Well, I'm wondering if that was convincing when you saw it the second time. Do you now accept that you're part of Generation X after all, or what do you think about that quasi argument? Maybe it was an impressionistic one.
Well, the point that you're making is, of course, true, that all of the generations are subject to alienation. They all produce wealth, power, productive capacity that they then cannot dispose of and exercise. And they all experience an alienation from the enormous power, enormous capacity that they, of course, produce and which comes from them. That is true across the board. When I was talking about a difference, I was not talking about a difference in that regard. I wasn't claiming that some generations experience alienation and others don't. I was talking about the specific conditions that are brought about by particular changes that have occurred in capitalism and in the world system over the course of the post-World War II period.
Right. So the thing is about Generation X in particular, as I spelled it out in the video, is that it emerged not only from the from exploitation or alienation, which had been around, I mean, since Marx's time, at least in terms as he is in industrialism, the Industrial Revolution took hold, but also from the political consequences of that system, World War II in particular, which was a particular kind of devastation for a generation that then shaped the preceding ones, and which I'm positing we've never quite overcome. That in this video, right? That that something particular happened after World War II, and that we've been living in a post-World War II culture defined by a variety of things. One of them would be mass society, mass communications technology, furthering industrialization, those kinds of things. I don't say that in the video, but those are things that are on my mind as I watch it again now. The other thing is that while there was this boomer generation which had more wealth, especially in the United States, It wasn't the same way in Europe, and it certainly wasn't the same across the world. But in the United States, there was a boomer generation that really benefited from the wealth of America. Even they were defined by this X in a variety of ways. And within the United States, there was an uneven distribution. There was a class society, and then very quickly after the boomers enjoyed their wealth, the prospects for future generations, starting with mine, declined dramatically. So that might be where we could start because we don't really disagree about the big picture, like about alienation defining society. And we don't disagree about, I don't think about the trauma of World War II or the kind of big picture about mass society emerging after that. Maybe we do, but it's more the specifics of how much of a economic, technological, and cultural burden the millennials in particular, and maybe now the Zoomers, are have on their shoulders and have to withstand in comparison to previous generations. Are things getting worse? Or are things getting better? Or are they getting worse? Or are they staying the same? Is maybe what is at issue here.
Well, things are getting different.
Mm-hmm.
Really, the point is, for me, things are getting different in ways that we have to track if we're going to be able to understand what's going on or potentially generate a capacity to intervene in it. So where I think we agree, I think that the post-World War II system is very acutely alienating. Alienation, of course, existed prior to the war, but part of the reason that alienation becomes a larger part of the discussion after the war is that the post-war system generates a more acute feeling of alienation, in part because it's very politically alienating. Whereas before the war, there's still a lot of widespread belief that reform or revolution, you can engage in political activity that might transform the conditions in your society very sizably. In the post-World War II era, you have these international institutions, you have the possibility of a coup if you elect the wrong kind of government that isn't compliant with your country's position within the system. There's a restriction of the horizon of possibility for political activity, which generates a sense of alienation, not just from what you produce, but also from the state power that you produce. So there's a sense in which democracy comes to feel increasingly empty, which leads to arguments like Jürgen Habermas and Legitimation Crisis about democracy revealing itself to be non-substantive in some way over the course of this period. Of course, he thought that would nonetheless have some kind of revolutionary potential to it. And I think one of the things that we've discovered over the course of this period is that is not obviously the case. Indeed, I think it would be quite difficult to make that case, that experience is itself in some way generative of revolutionary energy. The point of emphasis I was trying to make is that over the course of this period, you have the expansion of the university graduate cohort, and that expansion introduces certain kinds of fractures. And then people, depending upon when they're born post-World War II, have different relationships to that expansion, depending on whether they come along at such a point that they personally benefit from it, and to what degree do they personally benefit from it. And for me, that is one of the things that is really different. I kind of frame, not so much in my books, but in some of my more recent talks, a distinction between a kind of early capitalism and a middle capitalism in which the graduate part of the population expands to the point at which it can think of itself as potentially an independent force. That thinking of itself as an independent force is a mistake. It can't actually govern. It isn't capable of operating independently, but it gets large enough to think that it can operate independently. And then this illusion that the graduates have that they are ascendant or that they have transcended the need for the non-graduates produces a continuous tension in politics that would not have been there at a time when the graduate part of the population was very small, or when you didn't have the total society, you didn't have the enormous spread of managerialism in the first half of the century. By the time that you get into the post-war era, that graduate part of the population has become increasingly sizable. And it's the sizableness of this that changes, I think, to a significant degree, the character of our political disputes. And I think there's a tendency for generations to have different levels of awareness or consciousness or different attitudes to that split, because people enter into the university system at different points in the development.
I want to, what I'm about to do will not refute what you just said at all, but I just want to make this gesture anyway. And so 1 second, hold on 1 second. I'm going to grab something. It's across the room. I've been looking at this recently. I've been indulging in some nostalgia. Hold on 1 second. I'll be right back. All right. This is a newspaper zine that I published, I think, in 1993. It's the unemployment issue of Diet Soap. This is, the podcast is called Diet Soap. It was named after a zine I started in the 90s when I was in my very early 20s. I was 22. There's all sorts of things in here. And there's one article, it's in the back, called Being a Proletariat in the New Age. And it's written by Brian Nedweski, who was a friend of mine. He worked at Osberg at the time. He was a boomer, a kind of cusper boomer. He was not Gen X. And so he was in his like late 30s. And he describes, and I won't read this to you, but he describes in this essay that he wrote for my newspaper how difficult it is for him to find a job. We had worked together at Osberg. Then he went off and did some other work. And he talks about applying for a job to serve espresso on a university campus and how they really wanted him to have a bachelor's degree in order to get the job serving coffee. And how he had to bring a resume to apply for this job where he would run the espresso machine. And he's talking about credentialism and the rising necessity for a college education in a way that he thought was ridiculous and absurd and insulting. This is a working class guy who'd been in and out of jobs his entire adult life, of course, on that level. So I just want to point that out, not as a refutation, but that this trend towards increasing the level of education of the population and demanding that workers have this degree goes back to at least 1993 and probably a little before that.
Goes back to the 40s. This is a continuous process since the end of the war. It's part of the transformation of the post-war system over time. One of the transformations that has occurred. There are others, of course, that we could also discuss. For instance, in 1993, my dad got fired. He was an engineer who worked in a magnet factory. He designed magnets. He got fired from the magnet factory. He was unemployed. It was a period where a lot of engineers, a lot of people who worked in something related in some way, shape, or form to the defense supply chain got fired because the Cold War ended. There was this reduction in military spending. What happened is that my dad was able to become an editor for a magazine, a business-to-business publishing magazine that wrote about factories. Even though he had no journalism or writing background of any kind, his experience in the field of engineering and his willingness to give it a good go allowed him to pivot and move into this other field that was tangentially related to his field, but also quite different.
Mm-hmm.
And then in working that job, he was able to get promoted up to editor-in-chief, and then he made a six-figure income doing that, writing and publishing a magazine, a six-figure income, which then permitted me to be what I am.
Mm-hmm.
Now you look at that magazine and that magazine company, it's increasingly difficult for them to hire and bring on large numbers of people because of the digitalization of all of this stuff. And you look at the magazine space in general, it would be very, very hard for someone to get a real job writing for a magazine that pays real regular money. That would be very, very hard to imagine. And certainly you would never say, oh, you get fired as an engineer, you should go work for a magazine. That would not be something that we would consider a realistic option. But in 1993, despite the transformations that had occurred, which were considerable, the graduate portion of the population was substantially larger than in the 40s, that process had not gone so far that you couldn't do what my dad did in 1993. So it's a continuous process. So, of course, there are elements of the early 90s that will remind us more of now than will remind us perhaps of the conditions in the 40s. But it's a continuous process of change. It's not simply a claim that it was one way at one time and a completely different way at another time, and that there's no continuity here.
This was an in-house magazine, am I right? It's a like a trade magazine.
Yeah, trade magazine. So they publish on process automation. They publish on different kinds of industrial tools, new technology that you can potentially use in your factory. They keep factories, people who run factories and manage factories, informed about new technology so they can implement best practices, that kind of stuff.
Well, I know a novelist who, now admittedly not an engineer, but a novelist who had been in the advertising industry while she was writing her novels. And she, for a variety of reasons, I think the company she worked for went under. I'm not sure, but she lost that job. That job went away. She became an independent contractor for a while, but that was too precarious. So she went and found a job writing in-house for an HMO, and was promoted up the ladder till she was, overseeing and managing a team of writers. So that writing wasn't really for a magazine. It was for a variety of in-house publications and promotional material for the health care, insurance company. So it does still these jobs, these writing jobs, still exist, and they still exist in the same way in terms of being the most secure place to work as a writer would be.
Yeah, the company that my dad wrote for, it still exists. But do they hire as many people as they previously did? Do they have as large a permanent staff as they previously did? Or do more of their articles come from freelance people or from retired people from the industry? It gradually, over time,
I don't know,
digitalization has transformed that space substantially, to the point where, my dad said the last few years he was there, it's good that I'm getting out because this is not something which can ultimately provide the same kind of life indefinitely. This is a sector that's transforming.
Right. I mean, my friend who got that job, overseeing copywriting for the health insurance company, she would not be able to take any freelance work. It was all in-house, and they would hire people.
I'll clarify. This is a magazine, so they don't work directly for the companies that make the new technology.
Oh, okay.
It is a magazine. It's a magazine that these companies buy advertising in, and they write stories which report on the development of the technology in the field.
Okay, so it's not an in-house journal for a company, but
it's a business-to-business trade magazine. That's what I mean.
Yeah. So that has clearly changed and gone away to some degree or another. And it turns out that quite a lot of, like, Politico, for instance, is sort of one of these trade journals that really relies on state funding. I mean, to continue, but not in the way we usually think of that, but rather just
this company doesn't get state funding. What it gets is advertising revenue from the companies that manufacture valves, instruments, control systems, and so on for factories.
Did they charge a premium rate to get a subscription to companies that wanted to subscribe to the journal as well, or no?
It's not difficult to get the magazine if you work in industry, because the advertisers want the magazine mailed to people who work in
Okay.
industry.
So it's a different model because like the Politico, it turned out they were relying on like deep pocket subscription money for a premium version of their magazine, which was an online magazine, in order to survive, and that the actual subscriptions for everyday people were tiny. No, you're right. I mean, this has changed for sure. But I just so what you're saying, there's less mobility amongst the professional college educated class today than there was 20, 30 years ago.
Well, a degree, right? So before it's, oh, I don't have a degree, so therefore you won't hire me. Now it's, oh, unless you have the very specific degree in such and such field or the very specific training in such and such field, will they hire you? And then there's also a set of fields, a set of obvious jobs that you might take if you had done certain kinds of degrees in the past that now are oversaturated or don't exist in sufficient number, such that if you do this kind of degree, the things that you obviously would have done with the degree 30 years ago are quite difficult to do. Maybe they're still done to some degree, but they're harder to do. And so a lot of people, even if they have not just bachelor's degrees, but master's degrees, PhDs, end up taking jobs that are different from what they really trained to do or what they imagined that they were going to do when they did those degrees. In the past, if you went and did, a master's, in some kind of social science or humanities discipline, you did a PhD, this was meant to give you some control over the kind of work that you did. But gradually over time, there's a sort of arms race, a credentialing arms race. These credentials gradually lose their ability to distinguish you and to give you power over your career. So there's constantly this carrot held out of, if you go and get a degree, if you go and distinguish yourself and raise yourself up above other workers by getting some kind of status marker, then you'll have more control over your career and you won't be subject to the vicissitudes of the market in the same way. And gradually, as this process unfolds, that carrot is held out further and further and further and becomes harder and harder to get. And so you jump through a sequence of hoops, each of which gets harder and harder to jump through. And that what is going on is that over time, this process is becoming more difficult. So when you start a degree, if you enter into something, the advice that you're given at the beginning is sometimes not even correct by the time you reach the end. I had this experience starting a PhD. They said, well, right now, the people who are finishing PhDs, here are their outcomes. But by the time you finish a PhD, half a decade or more will have passed. And so there's no telling whether these statistics will in any way be predictive for you.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
No telling.
Yeah. Right. Well, I'm going to talk about my personal life a little bit here. My girlfriend's a doctor. And she will occasionally complain about how, in general, doctors make less and have less freedom than her and father's generation. So, like she'll talk about in the 80s, these doctors were making bank, and that's why she'll say that's why the older white male doctors are so arrogant. It's because they come from a generation where they were independent and they made a lot of money. But now doctors are just employees of the healthcare industry overall, and they make far less and they have a lot less control than they did. And then she'll even go on to say, which is why there are no more women doctors. But what do you make of that kind of complaint?
Well, if you tell people the way to get out of the dilemma of capitalism is to become a doctor, lawyer, engineer, and you repeat that for decades, lots of people will follow the advice. And then gradually over time, there will be less leverage for that credential. It will have less market power. And so gradually working in those fields will come to be less different from working in ordinary kinds of fields. And there's a constant trying to get ahead of this that people engage in. But over time, it's become harder and harder to get ahead of it.
Yeah, I mean, doctors still do fairly well, but
less well now relative to people who work in the tech sector or finance. Doctors and lawyers have declined a bit relative to tech and finance workers.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, okay. So all of this seems a bit far afield to me from a concern that a socialist might have, because it does seem to be targeted at, the critique would be it's targeted at the PMC class or something like that. I don't know if that's true. How do you think about this in terms of class politics? Do you consider those people who are looking to get an engineering degree or to become a doctor or a lawyer as working class fundamentally?
Well, what it does is it creates first a group of sort of white collar professional workers who seem to be genuinely raised up above. But then as that part of the population increases and the degrees that it has are less distinguishing and less powerful, a large portion of that cohort is plunged back into a proletarian condition, but with the degree which was supposed to prevent them from being plunged into that situation. So it produces a particular kind of discontent because you went and did the things that you were told so as not to be in this situation, and now you're in it. And so, in my first book, The Way Is Shut, I talk a lot about how there's an attempt to hold on to a distinctiveness that comes out of acquiring the degree, even when you're in an economic and material situation in which this isn't possible. So it's not a thesis primarily about PMC elites. I would say that that's kind of retrograde. That comes from an earlier moment in this process where you might have had something which would have looked more like that or had that kind of appearance. But really, you were just at the beginning of a process in which the working class is bisected by those who go and get the degree and think they're better than the rest as a result, and those who don't go and get the degree and are directed to resent those who do have the degree because those who have the degree are pretentious and talk down to them. And this then introduces a split among workers.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, which is driven more by the people with the degrees who are not economically successful than it is driven by the people with the degrees who are. Because the people with the degrees who are successful are more self-satisfied, and they are not as resentful or as bent on looking for somebody to scapegoat. The people who do the degrees and then don't succeed have a bitterness that can be monetized.
Right. Okay, so one of the things we had this back and forth about your book and about the different generational outcomes and the differences that have occurred over time. And the reason I am pushing on this a little bit is not because I think that Gen Xers had it just as bad as millennials. I don't know. I think Zoomers have it worse than either generation. Millennials or Gen Xers. That's my
I focus
opinion.
more on just different rather than because it gets a little bit moralistic if you start saying who's the one that suffered the most and a little bit of Prussian Olympicsy. And I'm not trying to do that. I'm not interested in that kind of game. Right.
So, but I do think it's worth noting that the in the book you mentioned that the millennials had, like, the boomers had like 7 or 6 times as much wealth at the same age as millennials did at one point. And I just kind of immediately, like, reflexively looked up how Gen X fit in, and we were much closer. Gen X was much closer to the millennial position than the boomer position. Like, it was in like 1% or something difference.
The form of the wealth has changed, and the form of the wealth has changed in a way which has effects on the subjectivity. So in particular, millennials have had a much more difficult time acquiring home equity. And the largest inequality of wealth is with regard to real estate. So then millennials do have other kinds of wealth, but forms of wealth that are more precarious and are not immediately translated into something that is a straightforward good, like a house. If you have a house, this gives you a sense of independence. It potentially facilitates a space in which you could have children. It gives you a set of possibilities that having a large account with abstract money in it might not give you. And the tendency, of course, is to, the focus when people try to push back against the idea that millennials have a structural problem is to say that millennials just spend their money badly. They buy too many consumer goods. But of course, if buying a house for you is not realistic, if you don't feel that it's realistic and it doesn't seem to you to be realistic, well, what do you do with this saved money? The idea of buying a house as a kind of target has a disciplining function. It gives you a sort of aim or telos in your early career. that can structure it to a certain degree. If you lose that, then what do you do with this money? It tends to be consumed on the things that have been made substantially more cheap over the course of the last 60, 70 years. And this would be another one of the transformations of the post-war system. It has moved from a system which made housing, healthcare, and higher education relatively cheap to a system which makes those things expensive, but has cheapened electronics, consumer goods, food, eating out. And so then the incentive that you have is to consume more and to spend more of your income on that stuff rather than to save it. And put it toward a house.
To me, the argument that, the problem with millennials is that they just spend more on cheap consumer goods or disposable goods than the previous generations did is obviously wrong. I mean, because people say the same thing just about people who are poor but there
is a rational kernel of truth to it, because millennials do go to the craft breweries and they do go to the fancy craft coffee shops and they do these things in part because there doesn't seem to be something else that they can do with the money. They don't have kids at as high a rate. There are certain things that millennials do less of, and other things that they do more of statistically, which is a consequence of structural forces. I'm not moralizing about it.
Yeah, I know. But I have a memory from childhood where one of my father's friends was a plumber, and he went to his house. Like, my father was a doctor. This guy was a plumber, and his house was much smaller. It was more modest, but it was filled with tech. He had like a he did not jukebox. He had a pinball machine, right? And he had the latest Atari and a computer and that. And my father was like, he spends his money on all this junk, and I said, well, none of it costs as much as your fucking car.
There is a kind of boomer junk hoarding thing that you do sometimes see. I think it comes out of the fact that when boomers were young in the 50s and 60s, when they were kids, they really couldn't buy very much of that stuff. That stuff was considered highly prized. New clothes, a nice meal out. These were expensive things, even families that we would have thought of as relatively well off. And this is something that it took me a while to work out. My mother would say, or my father would say, we couldn't buy these things all the time. And so you have in your mind an image of your parents as having grown up very poor. Then you find out what your grandparents did for a living and what kind of income they had. And you went, well, wait a minute, they weren't very poor. Actually, they were doing reasonably well. It's just that the cost of those things relative to other things was very different.
Right.
And so now that those boomers are in an era where all of those things have become very cheap and the boomers are generally of retirement age, we will often see boomers, those who do have houses and those who have been successful, fill their houses up with consumer goods that they could not have purchased, that it would have been fanciful to imagine purchasing when they were very young.
Right. But I mean, the example I gave was like in the middle of the 80s, late 80s, something like that. And the plumber, I mean, he wasn't really a plumber, but the working class guy was buying relatively expensive things, but not massively expensive things. And it was his way. He had enough security. He wanted to have these nice things in his house, but they weren't. But they were all things that were going to depreciate, and they weren't. If he had 10 times as much money, he would have purchased very different kinds of things, possibly more expensive, definitely more expensive things. So it was a dumb argument to say, the reason why he doesn't have a nicer house is because he bought that pinball machine or something like that.
Oh no, certainly by the time you're typically talking about that kind of behavior, you're usually looking at somebody who's got enough house to be able to store the things in question that they're buying. And yes, that would be a trend that would be very evident by the 80s because of the integration of China and the various East Asian states into the system. Japan, the explosion of electronics production in Japan, the Japanese workers have always been consistently underpaid relative to what they produce. So yeah, by the 80s, you would already be seeing a considerable amount of this. And therefore, that is something that I think is more shared between millennials and Xers insofar as the 80s are the formative decade for the Xers. The 80s as a consumptive decade looks more like the decades that come after as opposed to the decades that come before.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so we were inundated with faddish junk in the 80s, and so were you in the early 2000s or mid 2000s.
The difference is that by the time you get out to the millennials, the housing situation, the healthcare situation, the higher ed situation have all significantly deteriorated relative to the 80s and early 90s.
But you could get a Beanie Baby. Why are you complaining? Okay.
Well, because I'm not complaining. I'm just
I know.
talking about.
That was a joke. That was a joke.
Yeah.
But no.
But really, like, okay, so then you have a set of people who are produced by this set of problems. And what tends to happen is that people get into a like whose fault is it thing, which presumes a level of agency that per your video, nobody actually has.
Right. That's right. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about regression here, because in the last stream, what I was attempting to point to was this underlying, what I saw as an underlying cause of the deterioration of society and the deterioration of our culture. But I want to be clear. The problem was not that things only got worse. Like, I actually like the Bobby Darin, for instance, version of Mac the Knife, but it was that there was a way in which the potential for critique and enough political understanding to organize politically to be a possibility was foreclosed against. That the culture managed to recuperate critiques of various kinds in terms of art, but in a variety of ways. And I just use that particular example. So that's what I want to try to overcome, is this regression, through recuperation. And what I worry about is that by emphasizing the changes in the economy and the way capital is moved around and what's cheap and what's expensive, and even the ability for younger people to buy homes and start families, we miss the political regression that's happened alongside it. And we think about these things in terms of objective forces that we really can't control, whereas one thing we can do is try to address the regression in our own political thinking. And so that's what I want to emphasize.
Well, the nation state loses a lot of its capacity to act over the course of the post-war era. There's a kind of continuous reduction in the nation state's fitness as a form over the course of the post-war era, which is experienced as this greater kind of political alienation in democracies. And so I do think that there's a question then about what it means to be political in a period where the nation state is the form that's offered to you as the thing that you would interact with. That form doesn't seem adequate.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you couldn't simply, it wouldn't just be to take back up the politics of before the post-war era, because that was politics that was fit for an era where you didn't have this confluence of international institutions, a confluence of international institutions which have themselves evolved continuously through the end of the Bretton Woods system, the rise of China, the creation of the WTO, the various rounds of GATT, et cetera, right? So to be able to have a politics would mean in some way overcoming or reaching the limits of the various international institutions that both keep us in the nation state and prevent the nation state from being an arena in which we can do politics.
Right. But throughout that post-Cold War, or during Cold War, post-World War II era, and through to today, there has been various efforts to create a politics which are not primarily aimed at changing the state. Those were the politics that drew me in at all to the left. It was not because I wanted to determine the policies of the federal government or, in Oregon, that
Yeah, I
I
don't think we
became.
can go back to that. We're not going to return to the nation state as a form.
Right.
But we're caged in the nation state by the international institutions, which both are premised on national sovereignty and which continuously circumscribe this heavily in all kinds of ways. So they're premised on a kind of chimera that's then offered to you, and you can only identify with it in a kind of alienated way. So what I'm kind of trying to suggest here is that the reason that the post-war era feels different is that there's an additional layering of alienation that the international system, the post-war system generates, that's very acute, but very entrapping. And we have not found a way out of it. We haven't found a kind of politics we can do that actually does break us free of it, because when we tend to look for it, we end up regressing into localism. We're not able to challenge the international institutions of the post-war era. And since we're not able to challenge them, we can do local stuff, which is always too small and never gets there ultimately. We could try to do national stuff, which then runs into the limits that are there from that system. Or we can wait for the system to degenerate in such a way that new openings are produced within it, which is what we end up defaulting to. Even though we talk about trying to do this or that.
Someone says that the thing that wealthier generations tell future and poorer generations is to be satisfied with what you have. And I just want to point out, as the older person in this stream, that is not at all what I'm telling younger people, to be satisfied with what they have. And I don't think necessarily
I don't think that's what you're doing.
No. Well, let me put this hypothetical out. I mean, it's as a thought experiment, which is always dubious. But when October 7th happened, and it was obvious that there was going to be an overwhelming and grotesque response from the Israeli state, if there had been an American left or European left or both that conceived of itself as addressing the needs of society, only just even on a bourgeois level, just like we're going to be trying to protect the rights of individuals and the rights of political organizers throughout the world. So if there had been that kind of left, there could have been an effort from a variety of organizations and institutions which were not centered in the state, attempting to assist both Palestinians and Israelis challenge their own state on the basis of protecting their civil liberties and rights and constraining the totalitarian or authoritarian character of both societies. There could have been efforts to take up the Israeli discontent with Netanyahu and maintain it, or at least revive it a bit after October 7th. There could have been an attempt to speak to the class interests in both societies. I'm not saying it would have been immediately successful, but that would be the direction I would want a left to go in. And that doesn't seem to me to be necessarily so constrained by either the international institutions or the various nations, although it would face quite a lot of a great many hurdles and blocks as it was attempted to be done.
Well, like you and I could articulate what it is that we wish people said about these issues. We could do that, but this would, I think, to some degree, miss what is important, which is why that isn't said, or insofar as it is said, it isn't taken up in any kind of major political way. And that would be what happens in this situation. People think that what's serious is either to take up one of the nation states, put that flag in the profile, take up a nation state side, or they think it's petition the post-war international institutions. Because those are the two obvious things that the structure invites you to do.
Mm-hmm.
And while we're caught in this structure, we're not going to be able to easily articulate some other option. And when people do try to do something on a social level that isn't petitioning a state or petitioning the international system, what do you get? You get things like Greta Thunberg's flotilla. You heard about this?
Yeah, I've heard of it, but tell me more about it. I mean, I just sort of in the background for me.
So she's trying to open a humanitarian corridor. She's trying to run the Gaza blockade and get some supplies or some communication through to Gaza to highlight that Israel is preventing this from occurring. And, she alleges that her boat was bombed by the Israeli military. I don't know if that's true. That's something she alleges.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of social activity just comes to look to most people completely impractical and divorced from reality, because it's acting in the face of the institutions and structures which actually do have power to change the situation. It's nation states and, to some degree, international institutions that have the ability to shape what goes on over there. And there's a question about what's the balance between nation states and international institutions, and which one circumscribes the other. In this particular instance, is the international institution limited by the need to be consistent with the principle of national sovereignty, or are the nation states limited by their need to conform with the imperatives of being part of the international system of global trade, which is the dominant thing in this particular instance? That becomes the neo-neo debate, the neo-realist versus neoliberal institutionalist debate, which is had in IR all the time, which is just about which side of this matters more in a particular instance. But what's lost is any possibility of transcending that duality.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing about that flotilla is that it's an attempt to skip over the need to actually organize people in society and simply appeal to whatever moneyed interest might be around to fund a symbolic performative gesture in the region. And ultimately it's aimed at trying to appeal, I think, to international bodies to intervene in some way, or create a new one
into the societies of other states, into Israeli society or Ukrainian society. Who makes these interventions?
The United States, NATO,
states, and then TNCs, NGOs, organizations associated with international institutions. It's not like you and I. It's not like people in ordinary American society have some kind of untapped capacity to socially organize in a way that will affect Israeli society or Israeli politics.
Well, not currently in this moment, but there's a potential to build a party that might, or something like the Second International, where people were cooperating across borders and communicating and had.
Well, but that's the thing, right? When in history does the Second International occur? Before the post-war system. And so what happens when you try to, press up against the limits of the nation state in a circumstance where there's no international system to circumscribe what occurs? Well, you actually can potentially get state power. And then what happens? The states can pull out of the ad hoc, various bilateral, flimsy cooperative schemes that they're in, and they can potentially pursue unilateral strategies and tactics, and they can break down and disintegrate all of that. When you try to do that kind of stuff in this system, you tend to run into the hard limits of what the nation state is able to do. And insofar as you avoid the nation state, you don't really have a mechanism. Either you have a revolution in a country, right? You have a revolution in a country, you try to create a new kind of polity, and then what happens? In 1917, in the 20s, in the 30s, there was some possibility that you could sustain a state operating with a different policy that's not trading very much with other states, that is, so you could operate a polity, a revolutionary polity that would be engaged in some kind of very radically different project, and you wouldn't be immediately circumscribed by the rules of the world system, which would isolate you, cut you off, and destroy you, at least not immediately, at least not with the same kind of speed and pace. Ultimately, that is what happened to the Soviet Union. Ultimately, even in the 20s and 30s, the Soviet Union was unable to be sufficiently integrated into a large enough world system to sustain itself over a medium term of 80 years. But it was able to sustain itself in a relatively small unit of political time, say a decade or 2 decades. That was achievable for it. Today, if you try to do something like that, much more quickly you have serious repercussions that come about because of the embedded relationship in the post-war system, which if you try to exit means an enormous loss of wealth. So the ways in which the countries have gotten richer since World War II become themselves a cage, because you can have a collapse in the currency, you can have rapid inflation, you can have a major crisis, which can be inflicted very quickly in response to an attempt to do a revolution, in response to even an attempt to do milquetoast social democracy, in a response even to do what Liz Truss was trying to do in the UK. Very, very mild forms of trying to go your own way are immediately heavily punished in this system. And so then this raises the question of how can you differentiate while the post-war international system exists? While it exists at all. And then what would you do to try to get rid of the post-war international system, or to reform it, or to transform it, or to make it into something else? Because really, ultimately, we can't be trying to regress back into the nation state and into hard, competition among different revolutionary parties in different country contexts. That's not going to lead us anywhere we want to go. That just leads to war. What we really need is a new kind of supranational structure that is actually something we can use, as opposed to something which completely alienates us from everything that occurs in international politics. But to make something like that, how would you do it? The old way of doing it was to have a revolution and then export that revolution through a period of enormous disruption and violence. We don't do that kind of thing now. We think of that as completely off the table, and it's much harder to do. Because of the degree to which the countries have gotten richer, they have more to lose by doing that. Everybody has more to lose by doing that than they used to have. And there's no obvious reason to think it will work out.
Yeah. Well, I think, and you know what, in the future, we come up to we're an hour in. I think we should wrap it up here. I'll let you have the last word, but I think it would be worthwhile in future episodes of the stream and future podcasts in general to really look over the history of the Second International a bit more carefully, because it isn't the case that the only influence or impact that such a international socialist party coordinating between socialist parties in various nations can have is through a revolution itself. The existence of these parties and these movements have an influence on the way capitalism develops and the way politics develop. And so I think it'd be worthwhile to examine that and to think a bit more slowly about what the project would be if we were to try to develop an international socialist party that would include the United States, because I don't think that it's quite fair to say, oh well, given that the model of revolution, which already failed, is the only model we have, it's not worth attempting to build the international party. I'm
not saying that. I'm saying that we have to rethink the conditions. We have to look at the new geopolitical conditions of the post-World War II era, and what do they permit, what do they not permit? A lot of the stuff that we've tried to do, which is in some way from the pre-World War II era, hasn't translated effectively, hasn't motivated people to do things in the way that perhaps that language used to motivate people to do things, in part because we are operating in a different circumstance. So then we have to look at this situation, look at what it allows or doesn't allow, and then also look at how it might change. Because the post-World War II system has, from its inception, been in a process of disintegration. It is not something that is simply a monolithic permanent feature. It's something which was cobbled together, not in a very total or tight way. The way Althusser describes, this kind of thing was never accurate. It was never something that was so well constructed as all that. It's in a process continuously of disintegration and decay, which we should observe and pay attention to, rather than try to import lessons from previous periods where all sorts of things were different, both things we're aware of and things we're not aware of.
Yep. Did you see this comment here? It says, I understand Doug's instinct for something like a democratic Comintern. Seems reasonable. I want to point out that I specifically mentioned the Second International, not the Third, and I was specifically saying that the only, it's not the case that immediate violent revolution is the only path forward in this moment. So I don't think that's quite a fair characterization of what I was saying. But that is what we're up against. Is just when I talk about an international socialist party that would coordinate socialist parties that are struggling for people's just basic civil liberties and rights in various countries, that what comes to mind is the Comintern, and not Lenin even, but Stalin. So that's quite a hurdle to overcome. I suppose. Any suggestions for me on that? I mean, have I not been?
There has to be more of a positive vision, and part of the trouble is that there's a great reluctance to articulate a positive vision. The emphasis tends to be on negation, on pointing out what's inadequate or insufficient about what other people are doing, which takes you a certain distance. Certainly, we can learn a lot through the incompleteness of what other people do. But you eventually get to this point where people go, okay, put up or shut up.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, we're going to try to put up or shut up as we continue on, and we will see you all in the after party on Zoom. People who want to join us on the Patreon, please do so. It helps us continue these very fruitful and eventually revolutionary debates. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you all for watching.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout,